What about second breakfast?
Time for second breakfast.
What's up, everybody? Monster from Breakdowns for Breakfast here with another episode of Second Breakfast. Today, I want to talk about Tooth and Nail Records. Now, I'm not going to go super in-depth into this. This is not going to be a super long episode, I don't think. But I know that Danger and I have brought up Tooth and Nail and Solid State Records multiple times on the show. And if you've listened to our most recent episode on the Juliana theory, I'm sure it came up. I'm recording this before I record that, but knowing us, I'm sure it came up. Now, the reason it would have come up is because the Juliana theory was signed to Tooth and Nail Records. Now, I'm not going to go into super in-depth into the history of Tooth and Nail, just a couple quick little facts, and then list some of the bands that were on Tooth and Nail and why Tooth and Nail and Solid State Records are so important to my musical taste and also Danger. I think we've brought up on the show multiple times that both Danger and I kind of grew up in this sort of like Christian music scene. A lot of the first few bands that I was in were Christian bands, and musically a few of them definitely had that kind of sound that was shooting for the whole Tooth and Nail Records thing. Now, when I was a kid, you go to the record store and you would see Tooth and Nail in the back of an album, and you could be kind of like assured that this was going to be, at the very least, if not a straight up Christian band. There wasn't going to be any swearing. There wasn't going to be any sort of like, nothing that was going to make your parents go, hey, I don't think you should be listening to this. Now, Solid State, which is a spinoff of Tooth and Nail, we'll get into that here in a second, they were a little bit more lenient about that. Put it this way, if Tooth and Nail was supposed to be quote-unquote Christian bands, Solid State were bands of Christians who were, who kept it clean, mostly. And as time has gone on, the band that comes to my mind is He Is Legend. Their first couple records, without knowing, you just knew they were on Solid State, you might think they were a Christian band. And then as time progressed, their lyrics, became a lot more clear. And I think there's even some swear words here or there on some of their later albums. And if I'm not mistaken, they still are technically on Solid State. So anyway, that's neither here nor there. The point being that a lot of the bands that I listened to when I was younger and got to see live in the early 2000s were Tooth and Nail bands. And so I wanted to just kind of give a little bit of, shine a little bit of a spotlight on Tooth and Nail Records for a couple minutes, just to kind of show why they were so important to me. And then also Danger. Because like I said, a lot of these bands Danger has also seen live. We make jokes all the time that we probably have been to a lot of the same shows at the same time and just didn't know it. So anyway, little brief history of Tooth and Nail Records, and then I'll go through some of the bands, and I have a couple little stories. So anyway, Tooth and Nail Records is a record label that was founded by a guy named Brandon Ebel. It was in California, and he founded it in November of 1993. Eventually, the label moved to Seattle, Washington, where I believe the office is today. Before Tooth and Nail, Ebel worked for Frontline Records, which was another Christian record label. But they were a little bit more mainstream, I think. They might have had a few kind of rock and metal acts, but I'm pretty sure they were more in the mainstream stuff. So, like I already said, Tooth and Nail had a subsidiary label called Solid State, which was... Tooth and Nail was predominantly punk rock, had some emo and screamo, and then it also had some more mainstream stuff. But like I said, I'll get into some bands in a few minutes. Solid State was sort of like the angrier heavy metal older brother. Like I already mentioned, He Is Legend, Living Sacrifice, a couple other ones, Stretch Armstrong, The Agony Scene. These were bands that were not incredibly dissimilar to Tooth and Nail. They were just a little heavier and a little bit more aggressive. Then there was also BEC Recordings, which stood for Brandon Ebel Company Recordings. And this was a partnership with EMI Christian Music Group. And this is for a little bit more of your mainstream contemporary Christian stuff. Still had like quote unquote rock music, but it was a little less punk and metalcore and that kind of stuff. And then I didn't see much about this, but there was also Plastic Music, and that's plastic and music, both spelled with Q's, founded by Ronnie Martin of Joy Electric. And apparently that was more of an electronic artist thing and it started in 2001. Now, this is pretty cool. I didn't realize this, but there have been 8 Tooth and Nail affiliated albums that have been RIAA certified as gold for sales of 500,000 copies or more. And the most popular one of all of these was Under Oath's Define the Great Line, which actually debuted at number 2 on Billboard's 200 in 2006. So that's kind of cool. Now, what I really wanted to do was kind of get into some of the bands that were on Tooth and Nail and kind of explain why I have such a soft spot for Tooth and Nail. So currently, Tooth and Nail does have a handful of bands on their roster, but there's, at least when I looked at it, maybe these bands are really big in certain demographics, but I only recognized a few of them. The couple that I noticed right away was Emery and Slick Shoes. Slick Shoes has been around forever, and Emery sort of has too, but I've seen Emery live a handful of times. They're always fun. And speaking of podcasts, the guys in Emory have a podcast called the Bad Christian Podcast. I'm assuming it's still on. Really interesting. These are very normal day-to-day guys. They cuss, they drink, they're just normal people, but they talk about, religious stuff. They talk about everything, but a lot of times they talk about religious stuff coming from, these guys that are, they're in a quote unquote Christian band and what that means or what people think it means versus, these guys just being everyday people. So yeah, a couple other bands, My Epic, one that I had never heard of before, but have a great band name, Off-Road Minivan. I don't know if they're as strict about the whole Christian thing as they used to be, but yeah. So here's a list, and this is not comprehensive. You can go on Wikipedia and take a look. There are just the list and lists of bands. But here's just a handful of bands that used to be on Tooth and Nail and some stuff I have to say about them. So starting with a band called Ace Troubleshooter. Another band that was also on Tooth and Nail around this time was Squad 5-0. Another band that was on Solid State around this time was called Living Sacrifice. Now, if you don't know anything about these 3 bands, let me just tell you. Ace Troubleshooter was pop punk. Squad 5-0 had this like Motley Crue kind of grungy rock and roll, like real dirty New York rock and roll thing going on. And then Living Sacrifice, we did an episode of theirs on the show, very heavy metal, almost entirely screamed vocals. I saw all 3 of those bands live together at our little Christian club in Greensboro, Cafe Jam. And they were all 3 essentially on the same record label, and they were completely different from one another, which was a really funny thing because it was always like, okay, so who did you come to see out of this list of bands? But yeah, a few more. Anne Boleyn, The Almost, Blindside, Disciple was on Tooth and Nail at one point. I've played with them a couple of times. They're a cool band. They're one of those bands that have really gone through a lot of transitions musically. At one point, when I first discovered them back in the late 90s, I really, really liked them because they were, I don't know how else to put it. They were almost like the Pantera Black Label Society Christian equivalent. Like they had this sort of groove metal, blues metal kind of thing happening that nobody else was doing. They've gotten a lot more kind of like mainstream rock and roll kind of stuff now, which they still put on a hell of a show. I've seen them live a few times and like I said, played with them a couple times. So not a bad band by any means. Falling Up, they were a fun one. They're kind of like rap rock. Family Force 5. Now, Family Force 5 has come up on the show a couple of times, and I'm not sure if I told this story or not, but I when I was in one of my Christian bands from back in the day, we did get to open for them, again at Cafe Jam, and we played a fun little prank on some of the guys in the band, and I won't go into it too... I won't go into too much detail, but let's just say that we had one of our band members hiding in the back of their trailer, and when they came out to load up after the show, our band member jumped out of it and basically took off running down the street, and they were like, "Who was that? What is happening?" And we were just like, "I have no idea. Never seen that guy before." But they were a lot of fun. We might do a Family Force 5 album at some point because I know they've come up a couple times. They were a lot of fun. They were kind of like a mix of nu metal and techno and just had a good sense of humor. Further Seems Forever is another cool one. They were sort of in that emo pop punk kind of thing, but that was Chris Carrabba from Dashboard Confessional. That he was the original lead singer of that band. So that's kind of cool. If you like Dashboard Confessional, it's cool to go back and hear some of that. Love and Death, we did an episode on them featuring Head from Korn. They've since gone on to a different label. Lucerin Blue is a fun one. I don't know that they did more than just one, maybe two albums, but I saw them open for Disciple, and they were really good. They were, I put them in the same category as like a story of the year. They've got the emo, screamo thing, but they've also got some bounce and groove, and they were a lot of fun live. Me Without You is another really popular one. I never got super into them, but I have some friends that did. MXPX, huge punk rock band. They were one of the few that I think sort of, like OC Supertones, who were also on Tooth and Nail. A lot of people say things like, man, they were really good for a Christian ska band. I don't hear anybody say stuff like that about MXPX. MXPX is just like a punk band. And it just so happened that Mike Herrera, Christian guy, the lyrics were, good-natured stuff. A lot of MXPX albums are fantastic. If you like punk, pop punk, catchy punk rock stuff, skater punk stuff, MXPX rules. POD was on Tooth and Nail for a little while. Project 86, which have seen Project 86 live, also with Living Sacrifice one time. Project 86 was also on that Kings of the Game tour I bring up all the time. That was POD was the headliner. Linkin Park was the first band, then Project 86, and Head PE. It's like my second or third big concert, and I think that sort of put me on a path, I think. Already mentioned Under Oath. Another fun one is Spoken. Now, Spoken's another one of these bands that's been around for a long time, had some different iterations, but one of the bands I was in at one point played with them, and what was really funny was the name of our band was Source of Prosperity, and I don't remember what came out of his mouth, but when they were getting ready to finish, they said, we'd like to thank prosperity. I don't think he ever said it right, but hey, thank you for trying. It was nice of you to give us a shout out on stage. Obviously I already mentioned Under Oath, and then one more I was going to mention just because we did an episode on him was The Wedding. And so, back when I was, early 2000s playing in bands, yeah, we wanted to be on Tooth and Nail Records. Why wouldn't you want to be? It was just a nice thing that back in the days of buying CDs, especially the way Danger and I grew up, it was nice being able to pick up a CD, look at the back of it and see that Tooth and Nail record logo and be like, you know what? I associate this with other really cool bands. And so even if I don't know exactly what this is, or it could be punk, it could be metal, it could be kind of like, ska or something like that. But chances are it's going to be pretty good. And it's also really good chance that it's going to be something that I can play really loud in front of my parents and they're not going to get mad about it. So, like I said, we had, just did an episode on Juliana Theory. They were on Tooth and Nail. The album that we did for the show was a Tooth and Nail record. So does Tooth and Nail hold any significance to you? Tooth and Nail Records, Solid State Records. Did you grow up like Danger and I, where, you know, didn't have to be Christian music, but if there were too many swears, your parents might look at you a little cross, might make you throw away your Slipknot CD like my dad did when I was a kid? I'd love to hear those stories. But yeah, just wanted to give a quick little shout out to Tooth and Nail Records for being a big part of the soundtrack of my life when I was a kid. And still to this day, listen to a lot of these bands. So yeah, thank you for hanging out, and I hope you have a great day.